year ago today, a record-breaking flood devastated the New South Wales Northern Rivers city of Lismore. Locals have lived through many floods before, but this was the worst they'd ever seen. No one, not even authorities, were prepared for the scale of the disaster left in its wake. Today, many residents are still homeless. Some are angry, others are looking for answers. In this special program, we'll take you to Lismore to see how residents are rebuilding their lives. Later, we speak to flood victims still waiting for housing assistance. And what's the likelihood of a flood of this scale happening again? We'll have exclusive reports from our meteorologists. Welcome to our Lismore Recovery Special. I'm Rhiannon Elston. It all started with an east coast low which hammered southeast Queensland in February. This intense rain-making system then stalled over the New South Wales Northern Rivers. What followed was an unprecedented catastrophe.
Unfathomable.
Everything's gone.
Unrecognisable.
Gut-wrenching.
Unforgettable.
Nobody here knows where they're going to live.
On Monday, 28th of February 2022, Lismore was decimated by the worst flood in its history.
It's just so... I can't fathom the words, hey.
The city is one of the most flood-prone regions in Australia, with a long history of damaging deluges, but nothing like this.
Can the town recover from this?
Personally, I don't think so.
Over 1,000 millimetres of rain dropped across parts of the Northern Rivers in just 36 hours. That's more than 6 times the average monthly rainfall, causing extraordinary and rapid river rises. Not even the Bureau of Meteorology predicted the scale of this weather event when issuing a warning the day before the river peaked.
In terms of Lismore, the current forecast is for the river to reach the major flood level, and so that is below the flood levels that we saw in 2017.
The 2017 flood reached 11.59 metres. But this would be much worse. On Sunday night, the entire city was under an evacuation order as the torrent intensified.
50 of us are just watching the level of the water increase.
Emergency crews made desperate attempts to door-knock residents.
Hello, anyone home?
But the warning came too late for many.
Pets are still there. We had to just leave for our own safety. We couldn't stay.
The Lismore levee spilled at 3 a.m. on Monday morning, flooding the CBD. By 3 p.m, the Wilsons River peaked at an unprecedented 14.4 metres, more than 2 metres higher than the previous record in 1954. Hundreds isolated, stranded on roofs.
We had strength that we didn't know we had to get out, to climb onto the roof.
5 people died, thousands rescued, and countless homes and businesses destroyed.
It's unsalvageable. It's gone.
Lucy Polkinghorne, Sky News Weather.
It was the intensity and the relentless nature of the rainfall that made this event so dangerous. More than a metre of rain fell in a week. Sky News meteorologist Alison Osborne explains how the event unfolded.
In 50 years of records, the Wilsons River at Lismore had exceeded 12 metres twice before, in 1974 and 2017. But on the 28th of February 2022, the 14.4 metre peak was unprecedented. And to have a record flood, you need record rain. At the end of February 2022, Australia's east coast was already an unrun sponge in the middle of the second of 3 consecutive La Niñas. And with the ground already wet, met and catchments reaching capacity, rainwater had nowhere else to go. In the previous 2 days, a low pressure system had developed and was being cradled by a high to the south, keeping its movement very slow. You can see here heavy rain drenched southeastern Queensland before the system pulled south, focusing heavy rain like a laser beam over the New South Wales north coast. Now, this map shows its location at 11 a.m. on the 28th of February, just to the north of Lismore. The clockwise winds around it focusing that heavy rain and unleashing gale force easterlies at the same time. Now, the bright pink on this map shows an indication of the scale of this system. Over 400 millimetres of rain from the Sunshine Coast all the way down to Evans Head in New South Wales. But towns like Clontarf in southeastern Queensland earned the unenviable badge of 1 metre of rain in a week. As for the New South Wales Northern Rivers, daily rainfall records on this day 1 year ago were broken in multiple towns, including Yamba, Grafton, Casino and Ballina. But for Lismore, the weather station broke in the severe weather, and we cannot verify how much rain fell over the city. That rain was enough for a record-breaking February, the wettest on record for the region and also through southeastern Queensland.
The record flooding has long subsided, the adrenaline has drained, but anger, frustration and depression lingers for thousands of people right across the New South Wales Northern Rivers. Senior reporter Adam Walters travelled to Lismore to hear how locals are coping 12 months after their lives were turned upside down.
After losing everything when the Wilson's Rivers swallowed his home, social worker Harper Dalton composes and plays his own music on a donated piano to soothe his nerves 12 months later. Being smashed by the flood was one thing, but his hammering from a cold, inefficient bureaucracy has provided enough sour notes to turn frustration into anger.
I feel abandoned and failed.
Harper is one of thousands still waiting to learn how and when they can relocate their homes to higher ground. And a year after the Wilsons spilled over the levee wall before peaking at a record 14.4 metres, he now feels his head is being bashed up against a brick wall.
We've been left to our own devices. I was never offered temporary accommodation, even though I put my name down for temporary accommodation a week after the flood. I had no choice but to move back into my flood-affected home a month after, and I'm still here 12 months on with no indication of what I'm even eligible for.
It's a familiar story. Julia Melvin is still forced to live in a caravan and can't believe the inefficiency of the public servants who were supposed to help her and so many others.
It was unbelievable. If I told you the story of what I went through and you multiplied that by 6,000, it would be an unbelievable story.
Julia is on a long list, needing her home to be high and dry, but the failings of the system have been hitting hard since day one.
Yeah, I was living in my car. I asked for emergency accommodation. They said, oh, no, you've got to be actually on the street, and so I didn't meet the narrow criteria of being emergency housing.
The infamous Resilience New South Wales agency has since been disbanded after angry locals and 2 inquiries exposed its appalling response.
Strangely devoid of government intervention. It was remarkable.
And that was before a failure to address the trauma of the flooding disaster.
People needed long-term support around navigating the system, financial assistance and just emotional support.
They're still living in the shells of their houses, in caravans, in tents. Many people are homeless around the region. People are traumatised, they're broken, and they're looking for answers from the government, and that hasn't been coming.
We had a housing and homelessness crisis before the flood. We had 20% of the state's rough sleepers in the Northern Rivers, yet only 4% of the state's population.
As peaceful as it is now, the locals know this river can never be tamed and that moving this regional city to higher ground is the only solution to securing its future. But so far, the government has made only 25 offers to buy back homes for residents to relocate.
They've been dragging their feet. The bureaucracy that they've created, the Reconstruction Corporation, has been inventing itself as it flies, and it hasn't been communicating with the community about its plans to get people out of harm's way and onto higher ground.
I don't see any point in encouraging people to stay in high-risk areas where we can have 2 more metres than we had in February. That's our probable maximum flood height, and that is over the ceiling. I don't want to see children being rescued off roofs in the future.
Adam Walters, Sky News.
In July last year, a New South Wales flood inquiry report was handed down examining what is now seen as a botched response and recovery effort. It was this report that prompted the dismantling of disaster agency Resilience New South Wales and triggered widespread changes into how floods are managed in the state. Former New South Wales Police Commissioner Mick Fuller was the co-lead of the inquiry. I spoke to him a short time ago. He said he was shocked by the level of damage that remained in Lismore 2 months after the flood.
I couldn't believe what I was seeing in terms of the damage, and it was as if the town had practically been washed away. And the heights of the riverways that washed through from the Wilson River particularly was unbelievable to see those markings on the buildings.
What were residents saying to you about the emergency warning and the response to the disaster?
There were lots of people who were still clearly devastated, 9 lives lost at the same time as well. So there was enormous devastation in all of the community members, and you know what, there was some anger as well, some people who felt let down by the response and particularly the warnings to evacuate.
Resilience New South Wales, of course, has now been disbanded, partly on your recommendation. What led you to that view?
Really, the communities felt let down. They felt disappointed in terms of the support that they had received from Resilience New South Wales. The government seemed frustrated by the lack of grant money that had been distributed even before the floods had happened for important things like mitigation. So there was a range of failures that we felt that happened. The agency had been up for a couple of years, and they probably should have been better prepared for what happened.
Is it disappointing to you to still see people on the ground living in tents, in caravans, in the remnants of their damaged homes?
Yes, it is, and there's still lots of people who are couch surfing. You know, insurance may not have covered the damages to their homes, but the greater challenge is where to from here. We know Lismore is one of the floodest towns, or LGAs, in Australia, and it consistently floods due to the geography of the area. So there are some bigger challenges in some of these areas in terms of, you know, do you move the town, do you move the 15,000 homes that have been destroyed? They're not easy issues to grasp, but nevertheless, giving out small amounts of grant money to people in this situation is probably not helping them long term.
We have heard from residents right around the country calling for a more localised response to flood disasters, to use local knowledge to mitigate the damage. Do you think we need more local knowledge on the ground in the immediate aftermath of flood disasters?
Look, absolutely. I mean, volunteerism is central to Australia. It has always been so important, whether it's on our beaches or whether it's flood rescue, and we need to embrace that community spirit.
Your report triggered widespread change to how floods are managed in New South Wales. It's one thing to make changes after the fact, but do we need to be doing more in advance of the next disaster? Should, for example, other states be getting on the front foot here and making some of those changes?
Absolutely, and I think one of the failures across states and territories and federally has been understanding that, look, $1 invested in mitigating the consequences of floods and fires and storms saves $10 in the long term, and that's of course not even talking about saving lives. Of course, that's much more important. But we are seeing now federal funds, we are seeing state funds for local government particularly to build better roads, to build better bridges, and to help mitigate floods by dredging rivers, by creating water storage for overflow areas. There just has been a lack of funding for this from all states and territories and governments. And finally, the Lismore and some other weather events in the last 12 months, you've really seen a big change in the funding that's now available, particularly for local government.
Coming up after the break, we'll hear from the New South Wales Government to see where their recovery assistance is up to months after that landmark flood response report. And could we see another disaster of this magnitude again? Our meteorologist Rob Sharpe will tell you next. Welcome back to our Lismore flood recovery special. Thousands of people in the New South Wales Northern Rivers region are reliving the trauma of the disastrous flooding that struck 12 months ago. As many victims attack state government for an ineffective response to their pleas for help, a local mayor is calling for patience.
Aidan Ricketts stands tall among the heroes of Lismore. He's an admiral in a flotilla of rescue boats described by locals with typical bush humour as the Tinny Army.
The community will always be the first responders, but the community's good at that. It's already there, it's got equipment, it's got connections, it knows who each other are. So that happens.
And it did happen. The courage of Aidan and his fellow volunteers saved hundreds of lives, rescuing the helpless and frail from rooftops.
The most difficult was a 92-year-old lady just across the way there, and her sons. They contacted me straight up. You know, they're my neighbours, I know them very well. But, you know, we had to get a frail old lady out of a window and into a tinny, and that was myself and my 24-year-old daughter were having to do that.
The whole while they had to navigate a dangerous web of submerged power lines after the Wilson's River rose to a record 14.4 metres.
Look, there's a lot of really unusual navigation risks. The water's completely opaque, you can't see more than 4 inches into it.
On the first anniversary of the flood, thousands are reliving the trauma of a day that continues to jeopardise their futures.
As a 51-year-old woman with very little super, you know, it's quite a daunting position to be in, having so much debt and not knowing if my house has got any value left in it. So that's concerning. So I don't feel like I'm in a position I feel stuck. That's what it comes down to, I feel stuck.
As the inundation of Lismore was receiving worldwide headlines, there was no such saturation coverage for the flooding of communities downstream. And the locals in towns such as Woodburn and Wardell on the Richmond River are still fighting for the attention they know their ongoing plight deserves.
So the trauma stays with you. It's not only their physical surroundings, it's their emotional well-being and their ability to connect to services that are largely being forgotten about.
Schoolteacher Deisha Rose and her teenage son lost their Woodburn home and were among hundreds taken by boat to higher ground at nearby Evans Head.
It was like an ocean of water with just roofs showing all the way to Evans Head.
As Sarah Robertson prepared for the worst on the Tweed River, she sent her 10 and 8-year-old sons to Wardell to be looked after by their grandparents.
My mum said, you know, do you want us to take the boys as well, my two little boys? And I said, yeah, you know, for sure that'd be nice.
But her parents were forced to evacuate when their 150-year-old recently renovated home was swallowed by the Richmond River.
Young Josh turned up in one of the trawlers and picked up the kids.
Mark Robertson said the community continues to suffer and the stress recently claimed a good friend.
A friend of ours died of a heart attack just the other day. The stress had him. He was stressed. He was stressed.
And the struggle continues for thousands of others trying to rebuild their lives and relocate their homes to higher ground. In Lismore, Adam Walters, Sky News.
As we heard earlier, many Northern Rivers residents are still homeless and frustrated by what they see as a slow recovery process. Steph Cook is the New South Wales Flood Recovery Minister. I spoke to her earlier about why buybacks have only just begun. Minister, thanks for your time. 1 year on from the worst flood disaster the New South Wales Northern Rivers has ever seen. Just give us an overview to start with. What has been done so far to help people in that region?
Well, I'd like to start by acknowledging all that those communities have been through. It was a very, very difficult time for them, and it's been a long journey over the last 12 months, and we've still got a long way to go. But for our part, in the last 12 months, we've seen $4.2 billion worth of flood recovery projects rolled out across the Northern Rivers region alone. That's in terms of repairing and rebuilding schools, sporting grounds, roads and critical infrastructure. It was very, very necessary, of course, given the huge extent of the damage done. We've also seen $418 million dropped into the hands of individuals, families, small businesses and farmers through many, many grant programs just in the Northern Rivers region alone.
Yeah, it's a huge task, and as you point out, many locals are still homeless, living in tents, caravans or the damaged remnants of their own homes. Why has that buyback scheme taken so long to kick into action? Well, the scale and magnitude of the destruction of homes right through that region has left us with a very, very big task at hand, a very complex task. And the Deputy Premier has led from the front in relation to the Northern Rivers Reconstruction Corporation that is leading that piece of work. They have now started to make those offers to people, and that program now set up using the learnings from places like Queensland and other areas of Australia means that we're now getting the structures right, the processes right, to ensure that as this process continues, we will be able to see more and more people benefit quickly from the program. It has been a year though, and only 25 people been offered buybacks so far. Why is such a huge delay?
Well, the Northern Rivers Reconstruction Corporation has been working tirelessly with the community to identify the most at-risk locations. It's a complex process and project. Over 6,000 applications for buybacks have been received over that time, but it's really, really important that we get this right, and that's why we have emergency accommodation. It's why we have the Caravans at Home program, which is supporting so many people, not just in Lismore but in places like Woodburn and Coracai and other communities up there, and why we have the temporary housing villages, of which there are 11, and they are all up and running and supporting people that need it most.
We did see the body initially tasked with leading recovery to the region, Resilience New South Wales, disbanded last year following an inquiry, as you'd be well aware. Minister, to what extent has the underperformance and eventual dismantling of that agency slowed down the recovery response?
Well, it hasn't. The flood inquiry recommended through one of its 28 recommendations the establishment of the New South Wales Reconstruction Authority. The New South Wales Parliament passed legislation to formally establish that body. It is now well and truly up and running, and we look forward to it continuing to do great work into the future.
But surely the handing over from one body to another in terms of that responsibility has slowed down the process. Has there been too much focus on bureaucracy?
I don't believe there's been too much focus on bureaucracy. The size of this disaster has been unprecedented by anyone's estimations in terms of the Northern Rivers region and New South Wales more broadly. What we've set out to do right from the get-go is to set up support, stand up support as quickly as possible, to roll out grant programs that have never been rolled out before, to make sure that we support communities and people through those grant programs, but also to wrap around the community more broadly to repair critical infrastructure like roads so that people can move about physically in the region as quickly as possible. This has been a whole of government effort over the last 12 months. We still have a long way to go. There's no question of that. And as Minister, I'm determined to see this through.
Our reporter Adam Walters is in Lismore at the moment, and people are telling him they feel abandoned and failed by government. There's obviously a lot of emotion. What would you say to those people?
I can understand people being very emotional, particularly at this time. What that community has been through is just extraordinary. Every time I visit there, and I've been up there countless times in the last 12 months, I continue to be inspired by the progress that is made by businesses that are reopening, by people who are doing their best to get back to their everyday life. It's inspiring for me, but it also fuels my determination to ensure that as a government we continue to press on with the recovery efforts. The funding that has been provided to the Northern Rivers is also unprecedented, and we have the programs and the funding in place, and we will continue to stay with the community on this journey of recovery.
The devastating flooding in Lismore had never been seen before, surpassing the previous record flood in 1954 by more than 2 metres. Meteorologist Sharpe explains the chances of seeing an event like the 2022 disaster again.
When the city of Lismore was devastated by flooding, the whole country was trying to grapple with the scale of the disaster. And you may have even heard this phrase used by authorities over the course of the flooding.
I mean, this is a 1 in a 1,000 year event. This event is unprecedented.
So what does the term 1 in 1,000 year flood mean, and is it accurate? Well, it's not just drummed up PR lines for politicians to throw around. It comes from the Lismore Council Floodplain Risk Management Plan. It was written by river scientists, and they assess the river. They look at the previous flood events, and then they use mathematical models to assess the risk of different sized floods occurring at major locations along the waterway. So if I say this is a 1 in 100 year flood, I'm not saying that a flood this big last occurred 100 years ago. What I am saying is there is a 1% chance of a flood this size occurring in each given year. There's one more piece of terminology to help us understand, and that is the probable maximum flood. Essentially, those scientists model the worst case scenario for a location. It's generally assumed a flood of this size in this specific river would occur only once every 100,000 years. So for Lismore, there's a 5% chance of a flood reaching 11.4 metres in the river. The previous record flood of 1954 peaked just under the 1 in 100 year level. Meanwhile, last year's flood crisis was somewhere in the vast gulf between the 1 in 500 year flood and the probable maximum flood. Therefore, this event was probably closer to a 1 in 5,000 year flood, and it has a 0.02% chance of occurring in any given year. So it's extremely unlikely for Lismore to see a flood of this scale again in our lifetime.
Thank you for your company today as we look back at the devastating flood disaster in Lismore and the Northern Rivers in 2022. As we go to break, we wanted to share with you some incredible images highlighting the resilience and the strength of the residents of Lismore and the volunteers that saved countless lives.